The upcoming 25th commemoration of the Rwandan Genocide against the Tutsi focuses our minds, perhaps just for a day or two, about genocide, how the world reacted or didn't react, and how 2.5 decades later we deal with issues of justice, denial, and the legacy of that genocide which continues. Has humanity learned anything from the events of 1994, or does self-interest now, as then, reduce our action to the rather trite phrase, never again? I've learned that for many, probably most in the West, genocide is one subject they would really rather not talk about. We can talk about Trump and Brexit, the Gilets jaunes riots and austerity, NFL soccer. We have views on the cost of living and gun control, knife crime, our local supermarkets. But genocide, well, that's a word and a topic you rarely hear discussed at the dinner table. It is not just the most terrible of all crimes, but it seems also the most hidden. We, and I include our erstwhile political leaders here, just don't want to know when it is being planned, though of course intelligence agencies have this information, because then we would have to intervene to prevent it. We don't like to interfere during the killing stage either. Indeed, we pass presidential directives to stop such action, and we lobby furiously behind the scenes at the UN to veto any intervention, because, as we know, all humanity is not equal. Domestic politics invariably get in the way of doing the right thing for humanity. And after the genocide is over, survivors are too often left alone, not only to try to rebuild lives torn apart by loss of family and friends, health and homes, but also to battle for truth and justice, to counter the rise of revisionism, denial and conspiracy theories, which deny their pain. Most of us know what the Holocaust was. Granted, it was nearly 75 years ago, but you would like to think the systematic murder of 6 million individuals is pretty important. Yet a poll this year in the UK for Holocaust Remembrance Day noted around 2.6 million people thought the Holocaust was a myth. A further 8% of the population thought the numbers were exaggerated, while a staggering 2/3 totally underestimated the number who died, or just didn't know. It would seem we are suffering not so much from genocide fatigue, but genocide apathy. It is just another crime that happens to others, but we would rather not know about it. It's just too unpleasant. Yet anti-Semitic attacks are drastically rising across Europe, and the far-right populist and nationalistic groups are using the same dehumanising tactics against Jews as the Nazis did 90 years ago. Apathy has a cost. Since 1945, other genocides have occurred which have stayed in the imagination even less than the Holocaust. One wonders what polls would show for knowledge about the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, or Cambodia 40 years ago, or more recent genocides in Darfur, East Timor, or genocidal massacres that forced the Rohingyas from Burma. 70 years ago, the Genocide Convention came into being. Currently, there are 140 countries worldwide signed up to it, and it's ideal that they should, as signatories, prevent and punish genocide. Yet you would be hard-pressed from the list of countries where genocide has taken place since 1957 to name anywhere that prevention and punishment has happened. Domestic politics, geostrategic rationales, financial and business interests, and plain apathy have instead allowed genocides and genocidaires to prosper. Never again has proved to be a pretty limp phrase when up against such vested interest. So what, you may well say, what is this to do with me? Why is acknowledging these vast crimes against humanity in countries I've never visited, or perhaps even heard of, by people whose names I cannot pronounce, and often on continents written off as shitholes, really matter? Well, here are a few more thoughts. First, genocide is a crime not just against a minority group, but against the whole of humanity. If political leaders of the present and the future can decide that the targeted elimination of some of their own people is the best way to keep power and wealth, and that the rest of the world will watch, wring its hands and do nothing, then are we as bystanders any better than that killing regime? Post-genocide, the crime quickly becomes a statistic, which is of course far easier to deal with, divested as it is of all emotion and pain. 1 million, 6 million, 500,000. Maybe it's only when you come face to face with a survivor, or even a perpetrator, does the human cost hit home. When we give those statistics, names and addresses, and discover their loves and hopes and dreams, learn their life stories are just like ours, but were totally wiped out by this act of horror. Then the human cost, and the cost to humanity, can be ignored a little less easily. Surely the fact we cannot imagine genocide, or find it too unpleasant to even try to do so, should not mean we ignore it. There is also the issue of universal justice. We take for granted that when a crime as serious as murder or rape is committed, perpetrators should be held accountable anywhere in the world. Even more so, one would think, when the murders and rapes impact hundreds of thousands of victims. Yet the Genocide Convention's stipulation that states punish those responsible has again too often been ignored or avoided by signatory countries. Within 3 years of the Holocaust, 3 years after the discovery of the extermination camps and their terrible human secrets at Majdanek and Chelmno, Auschwitz and Treblinka, the Western Allies were already actively choosing to discriminate in favour of repatriating suspected genocidal war criminals rather than sending them to face justice. These Nazis and their apparent skills, information and resources, now the Cold War had begun, were seen as assets, and their genocidal pasts were quietly forgotten. The UK government of Clement Attlee first signalled it was against any further war crimes trials after 1948, and then it imported thousands of former Waffen-SS military, former police and militia, including in one case a whole SS division imprisoned in Italy, back to the UK, despite knowing their ranks included men who had organised Jewish pogroms and mass murder. None faced arrest or justice on arrival in the UK. Just a country grateful for their help in the post-war years as a dire manpower crisis had hit home. Since 1945, the UK has managed precisely 0 prosecutions for genocide and only 1 successful prosecution for war crimes. A recent Freedom of Information request shows more than 800 suspected war criminals are currently in the UK enjoying impunity from justice. Successive governments here have shown their commitment to the Genocide Convention is worthless. Specific international tribunals have been set up at the cost of billions of UN taxpayers' dollars to make some show of trying those accused of perpetrating crimes. Genocidaires like Milosevic, Karadzic and Vladic at The Hague and Bagosora, Zengiumva and Neemana in Arusha have all felt the long hand of UN legalities upon them, though the result has too often been the highly expensive UN tribunals themselves being in the dock for some decisions that have left both victim and perpetrator in shock. Surely sentences of 10 or 15 years for genocide and extermination of tens of thousands of human beings boggles the imagination. accusations that Judge Theodore Meron, head of the appeal bench for several years and the leading light in consistently overturning trial court sentences in favour of the accused, have led to doubts both within and outside the tribunals that political interference has been at work. A perpetrator has to look not to his guilt or innocence, but merely to who is head of the appeal bench as to whether he will receive a favourable sentence or not. Is that really justice? While researching my book on the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, looking back decades before the event of 1994, I was struck by the pattern of complicity by Western partners of the regime of Juvenal Habyarimana and his genocidal predecessor Gregoire Kayibanda, the first president of Rwanda. While much blame has been heaped, rightly so, on the UN, the US and the UK for their efforts to block meaningful assistance that would have stopped the bloodshed in Rwanda within days of its start in April 1994, it is clear several Western nations had, for the previous 3 decades, despite full knowledge of the regime's dire human rights record, continued to ship huge amounts of foreign and military aid, to give diplomatic and political support, and to fail in any way to hold the Habyarimana and earlier Kayibanda regimes to account. After the 1963 genocide that left around 10,000 Tutsis dead, Belgium reacted by sending Kayibanda more military hardware and military trainers for its already blooded army. After his 1973 coup that swept into power and condemned more than 500 of Kayibanda's politicians and military to brutal torture and murder, France, the Vatican, Belgium, Switzerland and Germany fated Habyarimana with every kind of support. After 1990, when genocidal massacres of hundreds of the Tutsi population were carried out throughout Rwanda, all these countries continued to grant Habyarimana full diplomatic support, even while he killed his own people. The Vatican refused to condemn him. In the case of Mitterrand's France, this support even included the arming and training of the Interahamwe, the ruling party militia that was to be in the vanguard of the 1994 genocide. Genocide is hugely complex because it is so bound up in politics, of those who would use the crime to stay in power, and by those nations who would rather turn their back and see the crime happen than risk geostrategic, financial or political damage to their own interests. Post-genocide denial finds it can quickly put down roots in this political and moral quagmire. No country or leader wants to be seen as having supported genocide, but at the same time the silence before, during and after is often deafening and tells its own story. Countries can recover. Rwanda 25 years on is showing how from this ground zero of 1994 and the 30 years of destruction that preceded them, a highly promising rebuilding process can happen. But beneath the surface there is still the unanswered question, could it happen again? A recent poll in Rwanda noted more than 20% of the population thought this was possible. We in the West should ask ourselves, if genocide was to happen again in Rwanda, would we react the same as we did in 1994? Do nothing and then help fund a highly expensive and politicised judicial process? What is our response to genocide today? In some ways it can be argued the Genocide Convention has been more of a hindrance than a help in preventing and punishing this crime. It has made national leaders highly reluctant to call events that meet its criteria by this term for fear of being sucked into an expensive, proactive policy to stop an event they feel threatens their own domestic political well-being. François Mitterrand famously noted, when talking of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, that in countries like that, genocide is not so important. horrific though this statement is, perhaps it was also in the thoughts, if not voices, of many other world leaders 25 years ago. And it's still there today. In what countries is genocide important? Just our own, our neighbouring countries, or white Western ones? Genocides do not happen spontaneously, however much their perpetrators may like to characterise the slaughter of their own people as such an act with no premeditated malice. Genocides are built over time, with organisation and planning, pooling together resources and preparing the ground. If the much vaunted Genocide Convention is to be anything more than a futile moral instruction manual, there surely needs to be a reassessment of what prevention and punishment actually means to those who are signatories. It is time genocide as a crime and our response to it was once again discussed openly and honestly.